All right, it says I'm live. Hi, everyone. This is Trish the Beekeeper, and I want to set it up so you can see my screen. I think I just did that. Oh, no, don't do that. So I want to give a PowerPoint presentation. If you've been sitting at too many meetings, I'm really sorry. But the PowerPoint presentation helps organize my thoughts instead of just showing a video. And we are going to start at the beginning. Slideshow. So this is a live presentation, and the idea is you can email me questions during the presentation, or once YouTube installs on my new phone, you could add some comments. I gotta double check that this is actually working. Yeah, it's actually working. Cool. Okay. So back to the presentation. Can you tell I'm not a pro? All right. So this is about managing your new hive for the first few weeks and feeding while avoiding swarming, because when you feed, you actually can trigger a problem with swarming. And it's aimed at people who have nukes or packages this year. It's or somebody who's made a split. It's really not intended for someone who has a mature hive, because the pressures and management decisions are pretty different. So with that in mind, I want to help you see the forest instead of the trees. So your mission really for these weeks, and it's going to sound a little strange to say this, is to get the bees ready for winter. What? I mean, it did snow this Monday and on Saturday, but no, that's not what I mean. What I mean is the bees, in order to survive winter, need to have enough drawn comb, which is at least 16 pretty well-drawn frames in a double deep hive system. Not everyone here is using the double deep hive system. Some are going to use a deep and a medium, or one extra large brood chamber. I don't think anyone I'm working with, I don't sell medium nukes, so there's nobody doing just mediums. So those frames all need to be really well drawn out. And what do I mean by well drawn out? This one's pretty well drawn out. See how there's cat brood over here, and the cat brood really can go all the way to the bottom corner of the frame. There's a little bit, maybe 10%, that's not drawn out, but it's not so shallow up at this point that you couldn't even have worker bees. So here's an example. This is not well enough drawn out. See how shallow this is here? So if this is the best drawn part, and then the bottom's even less drawn out, that's just not enough. And it's easy to fix this if you see this in July. It's easy to feed the bees. I love how there's a drone looking at you. It's easy to feed the bees and get this corrected. But you can't, if you discover this in September that a third of your frames are poorly drawn out, then you can't do anything about it. So you need enough drawn comb. You need a good size of population and a good laying queen in August. This goes back to the drawn comb. The drawn comb is the pantry for extra nectar on days like today, as well as pollen for when we have 5 days of rain in a row coming up soon, as well as the cribs for the baby bees. So you've got to have enough drawn comb to build up a strong population to be able to go through winter. And August is a very special month, because that's when the queen lays the eggs that will become the bees that overwinter. And we're going to talk more about that in another presentation, but you are aiming to have all this comb ready in August. I mean, we're pretty far away from that, but just to make sure you can see the forest for the trees. And you need enough stores laid up, and we're going to talk a lot more about how you judge that and how much there is that you need to do for that. So when we get closer to August, we'll talk about how much your hive should have stored up. And that's going to be assuming you've got all your comb drawn. So it all comes down to having enough comb and to being able to do a hive inspection to answer questions about what state your hive is in. Don't be fooled. This frame to the left, you can see, has lots of bees on it. So covered with bees is one thing. It's not the same thing. This, you can see this hive has all the frames covered with bees. This looks great, right? Well, and this, when you look down, you can see, oh, the tops of the frames have bees on them. Well, you can't tell what's on the bottom of the frames. Maybe they're just spread out along the top of the box. Maybe a lot of the frames look more like this one where they're poorly drawn out. So you got to be careful about that. So that means taking out frames and looking at them. And it also means making a note of how far along you are and using that information really well. Okay, so something to realize about bees drawing out comb. There's a pattern to how they do this. Oh, we just jumped here. So we'll get back to this idea. So inspecting do's and don'ts, because inspecting is really the heart of being able to manage your hive, because it answers questions about what state your hive is in. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about this. There's some do's and don'ts. Do light your smoker. And don't ever lift the lid like to change anything without your veil on. For the most part, the bees are just going to ignore you. But if you didn't realize there was a storm coming, or it's a lot closer to sunset than you think, then a few of them may react defensively and they aim right for your face. So just don't do it without a veil on. Okay. Do inspect about every 7 to 10 days. And by inspect, I don't mean look for the queen. I mean, it's a beautiful picture of the queen, but you need to confirm the queen is okay and laying well each time. We'll talk more about how you do that. And you should know your mission. Why are you inspecting? And when you first get the hive, it's because you want to make sure the queen survived okay. And later, you want to make sure the queen is still laying well. And don't inspect unless the bees are foraging. There are some special exceptions to this, but you shouldn't need to be in that situation. And you want to move like you're in slow motion. And you want to avoid squishing bees. So when you're pulling the frames apart, as you're inserting your hive tool to pull them apart, careful there as you're putting the frames back together. I kind of jiggle the frame closer and closer when I'm within about a 1/4 inch. Putting the box or the inner cover on, I hover it about a 1/4 inch up. I can feel if there's bees. They feel like little water balloons under there as opposed to hitting the wood. But I can't feel that as well with the heavy leather gloves on. So I use the nitrile gloves, and if you're not feeling super comfortable with them, try 2 pairs. All right. Back to inspecting for growth. It helps if you have a sense of what you should see. So they want to draw comb in the center of the hive first, or the center of the area that doesn't have drawn frames. They tend to start at the top of the frame. And what does this have to do? Right. So if you were starting with a package in the first week, they're going to have the blue shows their comb drawn. Second week, third week, fourth week. All right, so knowing that they're not going to have drawn comb randomly through the hive, and when you get frame 1 and you see there's no comb, frame 2 you see there's some comb, well, you don't need to look at frames 10 and 9. It's going to look like 1 and 2 because the bees work with the hive in a symmetric way. What if you started with a nuke? Well, you've already got 5 drawn frames. It's very important. You not get excited your first week. Oh, look at all that cat brood in these frames. Yeah, those larvae that got capped came with the nuke. That doesn't even mean your queen is still alive. So as time passes, when you hit weeks 3 and 4, any capped brood where the nuke frames are is from your current queen or your queen who laid those eggs 2 weeks ago, which is 2 weeks after you got the nuke. So that's the 4-week point. So within the first 2 weeks, all the cat brood here, that is from eggs that were laid back when she was in the old hive. So the first week, you'd expect the outer frames to start being drawn out. And then by the second week, you've got the majority of the hive, the majority of the frames getting drawn out here. So it's time to start thinking about another box. This is a lot faster than a package, but eventually you get to that point. And then week 3, frames get further drawn out. So you want to know, do you have a few really well drawn out frames? And then really you've only got 4 good frames. The other 4 are started. Or do you actually have most of the frames drawn out and 6 really good ones, and then just a couple that aren't well drawn out. So which one is it? You can't tell from looking at the top of your hive. You have to look at the frames. All right, so what would you note? So the hive on the left, and this could be what this hive looked like 2 weeks ago. So the hive on the left, what would I note about that one? I actually have inspection sheets you can download off of chickabuzz.com, and they have a little line drawing just like this. And I would write half because that frame is half drawn out. And I would write 3/4 because it was half drawn out. And then this is supposed to be a check mark. I can't make a check mark in PowerPoint without, I don't even know how I would do it. So that just means they're done. So for your first few weeks of inspections, your job is to get these frames drawn out and to make sure the queen's okay. The get the frames drawn out part, well, it helps to know what state you're in. Okay, so they've worked on the center of the hive. The outer edges are still getting worked on. So another way you could portray this, let's say you looked at the first frame and you just color in, shade in how much is actually drawn out. And you stopped here. Why? Well, whatever you see here, this frame's going to look the same. This frame number 3 is going to look like number 8, etc., because they tend to do things symmetrically. So knowing that means when you're doing your inspection, this is the information you can get from your hive. The first 4 frames tells you, yes, this hive has all of the frames started with comb, and it looks like they're at 6 frames really well drawn out. And you can tell that from looking at 4 frames, and that helps you decide your next course of action, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, now, that's great about the frames being drawn out. Okay, super. Wait a minute. What about what's on the frames? Well, there's a pattern here that you will soon learn to appreciate. So this is a hive that just has 4 frames really well drawn out. What they're going to tend to do is have the least drawn out frames have the nectar and pollen. They're going to want that next to where the brood is. So here, this frame in might have half nectar, half brood. So this brown is meant to represent the eggs and larvae. And the amount of brood tends to be greater towards the center of the hive. So here there's some brood, and here there'd be more. And then if you go to this hive, well, maybe they're next to each other. Maybe you started one from a package and one from a nuke. Then it's a similar pattern where there's brood towards the center, and the outermost frames have stores, and there might be 2 frames with stores in a row. So what does this mean for you when you're inspecting? Oh, you know what? Before I go any further, I just want to make sure we're all clear on what all these things look like. This ripply stuff here is capped honey. There tends to be sometimes an air pocket underneath. There's sometimes not an air pocket. This is actually race specific. Italians have a reputation for comb with air pockets, and Carniolans have a reputation for this. People, I think, they really prefer this kind of comb where there's none of the air pockets. But, so one hive might make capped honey more like one or the other. And these little wormies are older larvae, and this is capped brood that just became capped. So it's at somewhere between 9 and 12 days. And it will emerge in 12 days if this is day 9, or 9 days if this is day 12. So 21 days after it was an egg. All right, capped brood, honey. It helps when the sun is shining on it, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Pollen. Pollen looks orangish, and this is nectar, the shiny stuff inside the cells. So shiny means nectar, and this kind of colored in stuff is pollen, and it'll look kind of wet. Just nectar, as they're ripening it into honey, it develops this beautiful color, and it's shiny. So shiny, remember, that just means nectar. It's where the shiny is that matters. Okay, now, this is the money shot. Knowing whether or not you have a queen means knowing how to look for young larvae. So just barely here, you can probably see a little C-shaped thing. This is a 4-day-old larvae. So 4 days ago, it was laid as an egg. Here's a close-up. the most important thing I want you to remember is you are looking for milky. So it's not shiny and clear. It's more shine. There's some shine to it, but it's milky. So, yeah, this is also milky. I wish it was more in focus. So that's what you're looking for. These young larvae might be close to the older larvae, which are easy to see, but this one's about to be capped. So it's about 8 days old. These are 4 days old. So that's more fresh information about how recently your queen was laying. And now eggs. Eggs are about as long as the first part of the bee's leg and about as wide to give you a sense of scale. They can be really hard to see. You want to hold the frame so the sun is shining over your shoulder into the cells. Or possibly maybe even bring a headlamp. Yeah, here's our tips. I need a lot of light because my eyes are old. So pretty soon I'm going to be bringing a headlamp or getting bifocals or something. But in the meantime, the sun shining from behind is good enough for me. Eggs and young larvae tend to be next to the nectar or pollen storage frame. Sometimes the queen has laid there and then moved back towards the center of the hive. But when she's expanding, because all of that space in the center of the hive is capped brood, no room to lay eggs, when she's laying in new frames, she tends to not lay in the outermost ones. That is reserved for nectar and pollen. And they might not be on the majority of frames at all for an older hive that's had time to draw out, or a hive that has all this drawn comb. So, and they're usually next to each other because the queen would have been, say, at frame 3 laying eggs for a couple days, and then she'll move over to frame 4. She's not peppering them randomly through the hive. Here is another critical component of looking for the queen. If you go through the hive, you see capped brood, you see some larvae, and you don't see queen cells. Your queen is fine, as long as it's been 7 to 10 days since you last checked, and didn't see queen cells then either. All right, so this is what you're looking for, not the queen. You're looking for the things that equal queen. All right, so that's really important. Now, what would I write down about a hive that was in this situation where it had the nectar and pollen on the outsides here and there was some brood here in the middle? Well, I would write at the very top of the frame in my notation, P for pollen, and then nectar, and I would make a note it was only half drawn out. This one's totally drawn out, so it gets a so-called check mark. CW for capped worker. And then we'll say I pulled out this frame. I saw eggs next to it. I didn't pull this one out, but I could see it was capped worker brood. Well, now I know everything about this hive because generally these 2 frames won't be well drawn out either. And these ones here are probably also pollen and nectar, and this probably has some brood. So I didn't need to look at every single frame. All right, what about this bigger hive? Well, the outermost frames are drawn. Oh, I would have written 1/2. So I should have written 1/2 because later on when I look back through this, I'll think, oh, yeah, those frames are done, except they weren't. So you got to make sure you note that the frames aren't fully drawn out. And then a frame that's sharing nectar and capped in brood space, I would be specific that it was capped worker brood. And then you want to go until you see proof of life for the queen. So that was frame number 4. And now we know what the other side of the hive looks like. The outermost frame here probably is in a similar position where it's starting to be drawn. There might be some small differences. And then this frame is probably more drawn out and also has stores or maybe has some brood. Definitely time to add the next box. Both hives could look like this with their frames covered with bees. So you can't really tell from just looking how well the bees have drawn out the frames. You have to actually look at the frames. So adding the next box, this is the big question. Everyone really wants to make sure they do this at the right time. So you partly want to go by how well the frames are covered. If only 6 of the frames are covered, it's not time to add a box. If all of the frames are covered, that's part of the answer, which means either now or soon. So assuming all the frames are covered, you need to make sure that 8 of the frames are being used by the bees. If you started with a package, the hive might look like this, where the outermost frames aren't drawn out yet, but you have comb on 8 of the 10 frames, and the bees are storing nectar in them, and there's cat brood in 4 of them. If this is a hive that was started with comb already, then these centermost ones would already be well used, but the outermost ones might not have anything in them yet until, you have to wait a little while before that's the case, but you still have the top of the box totally covered in bees. There you go. 8 frames are being used by the bees. All the frames are covered. You are okay to go. And here's an example of how things could look. You might have 4 frames with brood, and then these ones filled with honey and nectar. So if you already have drawn comb, that's what they might have done. And they might not have done much with these outermost frames if, especially right now, they might have already eaten this nectar. And so they may not have very much stored right now, but this is still 8 frames being used by the bees. Okay, once you've got 8 drawn out frames or 8 active frames to work with, and by active frames, that means if you already have drawn comb, that's great that there's bees on there. What are they doing with the comb? Anything? You'll be able to tell by weight. If it's quite light, they ain't doing anything with it. If it's quite heavy, well, they're definitely started to use it. Okay, so you've got these 8 drawn or active frames out of 10 to work with, and one option is to swap frames around to encourage the bees to fully draw out the box, because they won't on their own. They'd be perfectly happy where this is. You put a second box on and they'll leave the outermost frames alone. Not very helpful. So you cycle those in, make them draw it out. Now you got to check this in about 5 days. Once they've got about half of this drawn out, it's time for the next box. And that might be as early as 5 days later. And if you're not going to be able to check necessarily in 5 days, you might want to go with option 2. So add a second box. You're going to want to bait the second box. And this is where having 8 frames that are already drawn out or being used by the bees is important, because you're going to take 2 of those frames, put them in the center of the top box. And then you're going to leave a gap, but you want to make sure there's buddy frames for the brood here. They shouldn't be on their own, because the bees really want to be able to bring nutrients directly over, and they share warmth. Yeah, especially with this kind of weather, they share warmth. So if you create a space in the brood nest with your undrawn frame, the bees will really prioritize this and be quite motivated. And you're going to have to take a step later on to get these outer frames drawn out, but that's fine. This keeps them busy drawing out the frames. But what if you said, oh, look, the frames are totally covered with bees. Here we go. And you took out the center 2 frames and you swapped them and moved them up. Okay, well, they are going to draw out frames, and you're going to end up with something where they get maybe 2/3 of the way through the bottom box. And then if you add a honey super at the point where they're 2/3 of the way through the top box, you've got 2/3 of the hive drawn out. If you were to take the frames that are all drawn out, put them in one box, they'd fill one box, and the top box would only be half drawn out. I guess it makes it more like 3/4. At any rate, it's a lot less drawn out than you realize. So you can really get trapped there, because you'll see you have a lot of bees, you've got a lot of brood. Oh yeah, put on the next box. Except if you didn't pull the frames out and really look, you could be fooled. And then that could be not enough comb to store honey through the winter. So don't do that. Here's a cheat sheet. I haven't uploaded this to my website yet, but I will soon. That has quick recap of the most critical bits of information I want you to be able to refer to. So I will upload this PDF probably tomorrow. Okay. So now it's time for the dark side of feeding. If you don't feed your hive, it can be really challenging, especially this time of year when we can have days in a row without forage. So you do need to feed your hive or be on top of their stores level. But should you feed just under any circumstances, just without checking? No, because a strong nectar flow, which you're creating by feeding, is a requirement to stimulate swarming. And that is a swarm cell. No, actually, this is a supersedure cell, so I'm kind of cheating, but it's still a cool picture. just to give you a feeling for what a queen cell can look like. Okay, it's feeding is a tool with a purpose. And here are the purposes you might have. To build comb. This gets us all the way back to seeing the forest for the trees. These bees need to build the comb that they're going to need to get through the winter. So that means they need to build comb, and it needs to be as uninterrupted as possible. Now, if you already have drawn comb, they need to be occupying that comb, and supporting the queen helps her to stay laying. So that brings us to our second purpose, especially in the summer dearth or when we're going to have days without forage available. You would feed because you want to support the queen to continue laying. All right, or because you want to prevent starvation, and that means understanding how much stores they do or don't have to really be accurate on that one. So if you have undrawn comb, that's easy. You really can't go wrong by feeding at this point. But if you already have drawn comb, look back up at the rules. If you're seeing that the outer frames 1 and 2, are heavy, don't feed, because you're going to be forcing the bees to store syrup where the queen should be laying if you're not careful. And don't feed blindly, unless you know from previous inspection that they still have undrawn frames and you've moved those to optimize them being drawn out, like we showed earlier. So this is something everyone can run into, that panic feeling. Oh no, I don't know if they're going to starve. Well, you need to look. And if it's poor weather and you won't be able to look for a while, some people lift the back of the hive and heft. And if you're really not sure and you really won't be able to look, just do 1 quart and no more. So let's make sure we're real clear. What is enough stores? In the comb that's drawn out to the left, they were converting those stores to honey. That's why it's the color of honey, but the nectar flow stopped. And so that's why it's not capped. But something to remember, a deep frame holds 2 quarts of honey. It would require 3 quarts of 2-to-1 sugar syrup to make 2 quarts of honey, because the sugar syrup is less concentrated, than honey. So if you feed 1 quart of sugar syrup, you're going to fill up part of a frame. Okay, so that's not too bad. If you feed 1 quart a day, you can quickly overwhelm the hive with stores. If they already have drawn comb, they have nowhere to store this. So just to keep in mind the maximum minimum here. 1 quart a day is necessary for the bees to draw out comb, if they'll take it. 1 quart a day is a bad idea if you've already got drawn comb. So some of it depends on your situation. Yeah, 2 days to fill a comb if it's already drawn out. So in a couple weeks, it's honey bound. Don't want that. All right, and yeah, don't forget, what if they're also going out and feeding? They're going to bring in the equivalent possibly of 1 quart a day, so that can add up faster than you realize. What is enough stores? Let's get down to that. The outer frames, half full or more of nectar. And you want to see nectar or pollen on the next frame, maybe with brood too. So it's like 1.5 frames of nectar. Or this time of year it won't be honey, because they'll be storing it. Oops, here we go. They'll be storing it briefly and then using it. So yeah, you're not going to have them build up honey much this time of year. I mean, they're using it like today to stay warm. So it comes and it goes. You do not want to see stores in the middle of the brood nest. This is a problem, and this means that the bees have nowhere else to put the stores, and sometimes it means it's because they chose not to draw out comb and they chose to pursue swarming. So that's something to make a note of. If in the middle of the brood nest, in the middle of the comb, you see shiny nectar and no larvae, the queen is not pushing them out of that space. Maybe she's in the second box, and that's why. If you have 2 boxes on, or maybe she's not laying anymore. Maybe she's not there. Okay, the rules of swarming. Swarming is a somewhat mysterious process, and I have to confess I'm not on top of it. I've had a lot of swarms escape my apiary this year. I'm used to really be excited about seeing a swarm. Not anymore, because it means I miffed. A swarm is really exciting, and it's really amazing. The bees are quite calm. You could stick your hand slowly into that swarm and pull it back out, and they won't try to sting you. I've taken a branch with a swarm like that and taken it, tried to slam it into my bee box that was down below, and only got half of it in. So I had to scoop the rest of them, and they were really, I'm like scooping handfuls. They were not defensive or trying to sting. When they're going to be defensive, they'll arch their back and stick their little stinger up, and nope. So what does it take for a hive to swarm? You got to have a nectar flow. The bees are not, they are looking to optimize their chances for success. A nectar flow, there you go. We actually had a strong enough nectar flow last week of April to fool the bees into swarming. And now, I don't know how many of those swarms are going to make it if they weren't caught and put in a box. You need to have a big batch of nurse bees that have recently emerged. And this happens this time of year because you'll have a lot of bees that emerge from the capped brood. When we hit June, July, we're getting lots of days of forage. You're losing 1,000 to 2,000 bees a day. The queen's replacing them. I mean, she replaced them 4 weeks ago when she laid eggs. In 4 weeks, those bees are ready to go out and do their duty for the hive. But now we're not getting as many forage days. And so a lot of those worker bees stay in the hive, and a lot of those nurse bees are rubbing elbows with them. Fresh big batch of nurse bees. And they have to have run out of room. All right, well, okay, so if you are trying to grow a hive, you're fulfilling number 1 and number 2. So we're skating on the edge here with a hive that we're trying to grow. We can do something about number 3. So we have to prevent them running out of room. And the bee's idea of room and your idea of room are not the same thing. They interpret a sheet of foundation as being comb that was started but not finished. And it takes a lot of nectar. And warmer temperatures are helpful, or a big population, to get the bees to draw out that foundation as comb. So by providing room for a new and growing hive, we are providing undrawn frames, typically. Sometimes you're providing drawn frames if you're lucky, because maybe you had a hive that died and its work was not in vain. And then a lot of these concerns are, you don't have to worry about them until it's time for the honey flow. So if you are getting the bees to draw out new frames because they don't have any comb yet, this is really a big part of it. I am going to say, though, if you have a hive and the nectar flow is finishing up and you put a honey super on, you'll have room for the bees to crawl around, but not room for a nectar flow. It can take a surprising effort to get that honey super drawn out. We're going to talk more about that in June. So just slapping a box on does not necessarily give the bees a sense that they have room. Okay. So providing room in the middle of the brood nest. So if they have 8 frames drawn out, then you take those outer frames and you put them in the middle of the brood nest. But you don't want to put them next to each other. You want them to be more staggered in the brood nest. Or you provide room above the brood nest. At least half of however big the brood nest is, that's what's empty up above. And so if the brood nest is 8 frames, you'd want to have at least more than 5 frames that they could fill with something above them. So if you have all undrawn frames, well, then there you go. That's a whole lot of empty space. You should bait it by moving a couple of drawn frames up. And you can move capped brood or frames with stores. Don't mess around much with frames that have eggs and larvae. Those should be next to nectar and pollen frames as best you can. But the bees compensate for our missteps, so don't sweat that too much. But just capped brood or stores are safe to move. So if there isn't a flow, foundation doesn't count as space to the bees, so they could swarm with undrawn frames. And if there isn't any room to draw out the comb or fill it up because you already have drawn comb and it's filled with honey, So you put on a box of honey frames above a growing hive, it doesn't count as room either. It has to have room for nectar or baby bees to count as room. So honey can be a blessing or a curse. And if you have frames right now with honey and you're thinking about putting them on, you should only put on 2. The rest should either be undrawn, if that's what you have, or drawn but nothing in them, if you have that. Or you could actually extract the honey from the deep frames, even if it's funny honey made from nectar. At least that way you're creating comb that can be filled up. That counts as room. That's the best kind of room. All right, flashback, providing room. Well, you can go ahead and move undrawn frames into the middle of the brood nest. Or you can move frames up to the second box, and this is just to emphasize these 2 center frames. I mean, if one is eggs and larvae and the other one's eggs and larvae, and there's pollen and nectar on it, and this is pollen and nectar, this is fine. You don't want these ones to be the eggs and larvae, and the pollen nectar is all the way down here. That's going to compromise their growth. All right, this is a picture of nectar in the middle of the brood nest. This is capped worker brood. These bigger cells are drone brood, so this is a foundationless frame. This is the kind of place I would look for queen cells. This is where bees love to draw out queen cells towards this edge. Oh, and this is honey, capped honey. So this is a great thing to see in September. The bees are backfilling the comb. This brood will emerge. Nectar will replace it. Good. That's going to get them through the winter. This is not what you want to see in June. You want to see the queen coming over here, especially if this is one of the center frames in the hive, and you want to see her filling this with brood. I mean, there's exceptions to this. When we hit June, July, the queen will slow her egg laying rate, and some of the outermost frames may well stop having a lot of brood. And then the center frames are the ones that will have the brood, and that's normal. But the very center of the hive, the very center of the frames, the queen should be saying, no, that's my room. That's what we want this time of year. All right, swarm cells. This picture is not my picture. It's from Beekeeping 101. There's lots of resources to check out about swarms. This is a hive that's probably already swarmed. And this is a lot of queen cells. It's not subtle when a hive has swarmed or is about to swarm. They're going to have not 1 or 2 queen cells spread randomly through the hive. They're going to tend to be in the center of the hive, tend to be towards the bottoms of the frame, unless you only have 1 box, and then they might be more towards the side, sometimes on the face of the comb. They didn't read the part of the books that said those are only supersedure or emergency cells. In fact, here's one at the top. And it's a swarm cell, because they're going to swarm. Or they did. All right. So how do you prevent swarming? Really taking out the queen. They think they already swarmed. If you do this, another option is to split the hive up. You might want to do this because you can't find the queen. There's just too many bees. She gets really hard to find when all the frames are covered with bees. Or this might be a better option if you have just 1 box of drawn comb right now. You add 50% more room and we're going to talk some specifics about each of these right now. All right, if you're going to take out the queen, she's not going to have any foragers. She's going to need nectar and pollen, or human provide versions. She's going to need nurse bees to take care of her eggs and babies. You can put her in a nuke box, or you can have a spare hive body, just in case you need to take the queen out. You're sort of making a split, but you could do this with the intention of culling all of the queen cells in the hive that makes the queen cells, especially if you just have 8 frames total. There's queen cells on 4 of them. You pop them all, and then you have to be, it's really tricky sometimes to find them all. So you have to take a fair amount of time with this. And then you can bring the queen back and they'll feel like they swarmed and they'll be ready to move on sometimes. You're going to need a box. You're going to need 5 frames for the old box because you're going to take out 5 frames. And you're going to need to feed them both to get these frames drawn out and to support the queen. Excuse me. Or you can make a split if it's a very big populous hive and you can't find the queen. This, here we're not talking about something that was 1 deep. This is something that was 2 deeps. You are just going to leave 5 drawn frames. One of them has eggs and larvae at the original location, the one that has all the foragers. Then give them 5 undrawn frames, and heck, if they have honey supers on, leave those on and don't feed them. Give the other 15 frames to another location, to the new location, and there's your split. And they're not going to swarm this way. So even if you left the queen in the hive that had 5 frames with the brood, with a couple frames of brood, and 5 undrawn frames, they've had quite the shock to their system here. They've lost all the cat brood, or most of the cat brood, and so much of their resources. This is a reset. And sometimes hives will build up queen cells because the rules for triggering swarming are you've got a nectar flow, a lot of young bees, and what was the other one? Running out of room. So let's say something changes. The hive starts foraging. You start losing a lot of bees. Capped brood is emerging. There's room to store nectar now. And maybe honey is being consumed and there's room to store nectar now. So things can change and queen cells can be torn down. But typically when you see as many as are in this example, they're not going to change their mind without human intervention. And in fact, you're probably too late in this case. They've already left. And in this situation, whichever box doesn't have the queen is going to make queen cells. You're going to want to cut those back so there's just one. You'll probably miss at least one. If you have a lot of virgins that emerge, sometimes you will have multiple swarms with virgin queens, one after the other, about every 3 to 5 days. And this is to be avoided. This is just a waste. Okay, last option to prevent swarming. Adding lots of room. You need to be aware it might not work. So if you have 8 frames drawn out, because you're just getting started and they've decided they want to swarm, it's possible that you're not going to be enough of a shock to the system. But on the other hand, just cutting queen cells doesn't work. So it's definitely worth a try. So you're going to want to disrupt the brood nest pretty severely, but intelligently. Like if the weather's going to be down, like tonight there's a freeze warning and it's May 12th. No, it's May 11th. Well, this is not a good time to set up the brood nest quite as maybe severely as this. Having said that, if there's enough bees where they'll be fine, then don't worry about it because they were going to swarm anyways, and this will definitely persuade them not to. You might want to stop feeding for a while because you've got a nectar flow probably. But this is, if you went from this many drawn frames to this many drawn frames spread out in 2 boxes, this is disrupting the brood nest a fair amount, and this is definitely adding space. It should work. What if they did swarm? You're not going to be able to tell from watching the outside in and out activity. Losing half the foragers surprisingly doesn't make a big difference in your perception of the traffic, unless you're really counting carefully. You can't really tell from the frames covered unless, like, you saw it just the day before and then you see it the day after they swarm, because there's going to be a lot of these cat brood frames that are emerging. If you have 3 of them emerge in 5 days, you just got 6 more framed bees in 5 days. So if you checked on day 6, or if you checked and you saw all the frames are covered with bees and they swarm the next day, by the time you come back in 7 to 10 days, you're still going to see all the frames covered with bees, even though they had swarmed and had half their bees leave, because of all the cat brood that emerged in the interim. So you can't tell from these 2 non-intrusive inspections. You need to actually look at the frames. The queen cells are going to be typically starting at frames 3 or 4. They're going to be many of them per frame, and they're going to be on many frames. Well, at least 3 or 4. And the bees actually will move eggs sometimes, or maybe they persuade the queen to lay in certain areas, but they're found where it's easy to draw them so they can be straight up and down. And when they're capped, the queen is gone. If most of them are capped, the queen is gone. There are some exceptions, like if you've had 10 days of very poor conditions for the swarm leaving, and you check first thing in the morning on the first nice day, the queen might still be in there. But especially if you see some that are uncapped and you know it's been 10 days. I mean, this is about the only time of year that's going to be true, that we have stretches where it's a poor conditions for a swarm to leave. All right, so what do you do if they swarm? Well, if you didn't see them leave, you have to confirm this. So seeing these queen cells, it's a guarantee they swarmed when you see that many. If you just see one queen cell, they might not have swarmed. You need to investigate further and check for eggs, because sometimes it's a supersedure cell. There's going to tend to be a handful of those, and they're going to tend to be not necessarily, they're going to be tucked in a few corners, but not necessarily at the bottom of the frame, although they might be at the bottom of the frame. The bees, typically with a situation where the queen is fading, they have time to choose a good location where they can draw out a nice long queen cell. So if they're in a supersedure situation, just leave them alone, let them do their thing. If they've already swarmed, well, you need to confirm that. So you'll need to look at and make sure there's queen cells on more than just one frame, and it's more than just 1 or 2 queen cells. And actually, here is something about whether or not they swarmed. If this is one of many queen cells, see how this is all round? That means the queen cut herself out, and the virgin queen is walking around on the comb somewhere. So that gives you a sense of the timing here. I mean, that could happen with a supersedure as well. Sometimes the queen who's going to supersede the original queen will fly out, get mated, come back, and just lay side by side with the old queen. So you don't want to necessarily panic and react. You want to confirm that they swarmed, and really the number of queen cells is one of the best ways. That's probably the only way. Okay, next step, get out your calendar. What? Because capped queen cell, you have either 0 days until the queen's out, like she'll emerge as soon as you close the hive, or it'll be 8 days until the queen is out, because they just capped it and it's capped for 8 days. So if you don't know, like it's been 10 days since you were in the hive, you just don't know when they might have made that cell, then you've got a range there. Now, this time of year is a great illustration. You've got a minimum of 5 and a maximum of 21 days until she flies. So yesterday, actually, we had this weird stretch. The day started like almost snowing and terrible. And then, well, not terrible. It started out, it wasn't as cold as the day before, but then we had a rainy period in the middle of the day. And it was like cold and rainy, and it was like, oh, already the cold weather is here. But then we had this hour starting at 5 o'clock where it was like 65 and fairly calm and sunny. I think some of my queens might have flown. It was really like a half an hour break. So I don't know. Some of them might not have made it back. But really, looking at the forecast, that was it until we get like 7 to 8 days from now. Because she wants the temperature to be higher than 60 and not windy, and prefers sunny. So a little picky. The drones are not as picky about when they fly, but the queen sure is. Okay, 5 days after she flies, which might have been yesterday, might be 10 days from now. I've got a range here. 5 days after she flies, she's going to lay eggs. Putting it together, if you saw a queen cell May 1st, and somehow they could have flown somewhere other than Ohio on May 5th or 6th, you might have eggs as early as May 10th or as late as June 1st, because she didn't fly until May 22nd. Actually, then I would expect it'd be more like May 28th that you would have eggs. Oh, but not if the queen cell was just capped. Then it could be June 1st because she had to wait a really long time to get out and fly. All right. Okay, the third thing. So you've gotten your calendar out. You've got these days. We'll talk more about them later. You might not see eggs if she's back and she's laying because she's going to start with a palm-sized patch of eggs. And you might have 10 frames covered with bees. So this can be hard to see. And it takes a while for her to ramp up. So she lays a lot more slowly than she will when she's under full power. You will be able to see a palm-sized patch of cap worker brood. That's 11 days after she starts laying. So trying to make sure she's back immediately is really a challenge. Okay, and then the fourth thing, 3 weeks after you see a queen cell, or 2 weeks after she likely emerged, it's imperative you try to get eggs or a grafted queen cell in. Why? Because if you don't, there's a risk that the bees that are in there will transition from being nurse bees or forager bees or whatever role they're in currently, to having some develop their ovaries and become laying workers. And there'd be a certain percentage of them. And it's hard to reverse a hive from the laying worker state back to one that can receive and support a queen. It takes introduction of eggs and larvae, possibly once a week for 3 weeks, to reset them and get them to draw out a queen cell. So you want to avoid that. Okay, here's a case study. On May 2nd, you see a queen cell. On April 20th, you installed a nuke and you saw the queen. So now what? Well, this queen cell here, remember I said the tip is open? Well, it's been 16 days since that egg was laid. It's been 12 days since they started to make the queen cell. Well, 12 days ago, the nuke was installed. It may well be during the installation. Even though you saw the queen, she was somehow killed. So dates like when you installed the nuke, when you last saw evidence of the queen, become very important when you're trying to reconstruct things. And evidence of the queen is not cat brood. That's stale news. She was there 9 to 20 days ago, and that's not good enough. You need to see evidence the queen was laying recently. All right, but in this situation, now what? So, some things we can infer here. There's a risk of laying workers starting 21 days post when this queen came out. We can be fairly sure she came out close to May 2nd, based on when we installed the nuke and saw the queen. So May 23rd is our danger day. We need to intervene at this point. And I don't mean buy a queen and pop her in there. That's a good way to waste $35. I mean intervene if you don't see eggs and larvae, because they might be coming and they might not be, but either way, you have to prevent laying workers. Okay, just to recap, May 2nd, the queen was out. And she probably wasn't out. Maybe she was out May 1st, but it was somewhere close to May 2nd, just based on when you saw the queen last. Her first fly day, just in this case, poor weather until May 19th, like this year. So then by May 26th, you should see eggs. When would you see capped brood? Well, you would see capped brood 9 days after she starts laying eggs. That gets us into the beginning of June. So this is a month since this queen emerged. You're going to need to take action before then to help prevent laying workers. So what is the action day? Well, it's 21 days after the queen emerged. At that point, the bees will have been without brood or a queen pheromone, possibly, for long enough to start to develop as laying workers. Now, in the example here, this is perfect because you might not even see eggs until May 26th, but she's still there. Or maybe she flew and didn't come back. The action day is to prevent laying workers and to tell you whether or not there's a queen in there. It's not go buy a queen day. The action day is to either add eggs if you have another hive or a grafted queen cup. And I can provide one of those. And then see what they do. So May 23rd, 21 days, is your action day. And you should write that on your calendar in this case. All right, here's another case study. We're going to use our math again. And May 20th, you see queen cells. So now what? Well, we need a little bit of history to know what to do. Oh, they're uncapped. Oh, and some details. 1 or 2 are capped, but most of them are uncapped. So it's been really nice weather. It's going to continue to be nice weather. That queen probably swarmed the day before. And if they were just capped, they tend to mature at the same time. Well, it's time to do some math. Day 0, the eggs are laid. Day 8, the queen cells are capped. So these queen cells are 8 days old, maybe 9 days old. So day 16, they're out. And so what I will do is I will take a lined sheet of notebook paper and I will write 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 16 next to the actual dates. And then I will look for 10 days after she's out and say, oh, it's the earliest eggs. If it's good foraging. Oh, okay, day 21, I'm going to add eggs. Or I should see cap worker brood by then. Okay, so that is what I've got for you today. Happy bee watching, and let me know if you have any questions. I have inspection sheets up on the website. I'm going to have a summary sheet from this second part of the presentation about swarming. And yes, hopefully the weather will continue to be good for the bees, or become good for the bees, rather. All right, so now I'm going to end the live stream. It takes a minute. And have a good